herbicide and for the production of methane, which goes into food. Now, the modern catalyst itself is more complex. It's not just bismuth and molybdenum. It has other metals such as iron, cobalt, manganese, others. However, it is very frequent that you study the bismuth molybdate catalyst itself, and bismuth molybdenum alone, just because it approximates to a very good extent the activity and selectivity of the industrial catalyst. So to sum it all up, we can say that bismuth molybdates are mixed metal oxides, which are used for propylene selective oxidation or oxidation, and this is termed the Soyo process, as you can see here, or you can't, because there's no pointer, just a second. There we go. It was recognized as a National Historic Chemical Landmark a while ago. So, what do we know about how what the structures are during the reaction, how they change? Well, the earliest models we have are from the Grosselli group. Now, Grosselli came from Callahan group, that at Central Ohio. And he suggested that it's basically a surface as an extension of the ball crystalline, and that the surface has bimetallic active sites with molybdenum and bismuth. The molybdenum goes from 6 plus to 5 plus, 4 plus to 3 plus, and the bismuth goes from 3 plus to 2 plus. However, there was no actual supporting data to actually prove that this was happening. But later on, the other groups suggested using several AFT models, several models that could explain what's going on here. Initially, this suggested models in which you just have molybdenum acting, changing. The bismuth was not directly participating. However, later on, they suggested bismuth does participate, but not the way you'd expect, not bismuth 3 plus, but in fact rare, highly oxidized bismuth 5 plus, 4 plus sites, which are reduced during the first stage extraction to 4 plus, 3 plus, and then we get reoxidized. While the rest of the reaction happens on the molybdenum sites. Finally, the latest model we have came from the Bell group. It was based on X-Stains data that was gathered after 24 hours under propylene flow. And what they saw is that basically the molybdenum starts at 6 plus and ends as 4 plus, and bismuth remains unreduced. And they concluded that the reaction happens only on the molybdenum sites, very similar to what the early Goddard model suggested, and that the bismuth indeed goes from 6 plus to 4 plus during the reaction. So what kind of data we have that is relevant from the literature? Well, we have in situ electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy, or ESR also. These experiments did show that molybdenum 5 plus is formed under reaction conditions, but this is over the entire ball. It doesn't really tell us anything about the surface specifically. In addition, we have in situ hexanes that we saw, and these indicate that molybdenum goes from 6 plus to 4 plus. Bismuth remains unreduced. Again, bulk analysis. And we have very little data that is relevant, but yet ultra-high vacuum XPS data suggests that both the bismuth and the molybdenum don't undergo significant reduction, and there was no experimental observations whatsoever of the highly oxidized bismuth. Some cases of the 2 plus bismuth and reduced molybdenum, but usually this came after reduction with H2, which isn't really represented, or after argon sputtering, which is known to cause reduction in XPS spectrum. So overall, we can say that the state of literature currently is that there is no in-situ surface region characterization, and the mechanism are based mostly on ex-situ bulk data. So what is our motivation here? Well, our motivation is to determine the bulk and the surface properties under reaction conditions. Now, our approach to this is multimodal. We have in-situ Raman and XRD, which gives information about the bulk structure. I'm saying bulk in the case of Raman just because the low surface area means we're not getting too much from the surface. We have ex-situ and scanning transmission electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or STEM-DS, to obtain spatial result surface characterization. And we also use SEM to get to filling out the particle size. We use in-situ EPR to confirm that we have indeed reduction of 2 molybdenum 5 plus. Though again, this is in the entire bulk. And we use near ambient pressure X-ray flow electron spectroscopy, or NAP XPS. Get an idea of the elemental composition and the oxidation states in the entire surface region, which is what we call the top 3 nanometers approximately. And finally, we use quasi-in-situ high sensitivity low energy ion scattering, or HSLight, a very exciting and cool technique, which gives you an idea of the elemental composition. We can do this even with depth profile, which means you can get information atomic layer by atomic layer. So what can we learn from this data? Let's start with the incident Raman XRD. On the left, you can see the alpha bismuth molybdate with the Raman spectra. On the right, you can see the XRD diffractograms. What you can see is what happens under the 3 incident conditions. In gray, you can see the oxidized catalyst. In orange, you can see the reaction conditions. And in green, you can see the reducing conditions, just covalent. What you can see is that the structure, both by XRD and Raman, agrees to just have alpha bismuth molybdate and it's stable. So the bulk itself doesn't really undergo any significant changes that we can see during the reaction or even under reducing conditions. XU SDMDS can show us several things using the AJADF image you can see on the left. What you can see here is that the topmost surface area, so about 1 to 3 nanometers, isn't actually an extension of the bulk as sometimes it's assumed. It's actually amorphous. More than that, we can see that the molybdenum is homogeneously distributed with some of the bismuth, while the bismuth is also present as small clusters of amorphous bismuth oxide. And this was further confirmed on industrial catalysts just to make sure that it's not something that happened on our house. Not shown here, SEM images yielded an average particle diameter of 1.4 micrometers, and that's important for the EPR as we'll see in a second. So in situ EPR spectrum, what it told us is that when we go from the bottom up, from oxidizing conditions, high temperatures, switch to reducing, cool down to get a good spectrum by quenching, we can see the molybdenum 6+ is reduced to molybdenum 5+. At the 400 under reducing conditions with propylene. And by actually quantifying this, which is very cool, we can know that we have approximately 0.27% of the molybdenum that is reduced from 6+ to 5+. Now, EPR can't really detect 4+, it can't really detect the bismuth, so it's really very specific for molybdenum 5+, but still very helpful. Now, using what we found with the SEM, we know that the surface atoms make up about 0.02% of all the atoms. And this tells us that the molybdenum 5+ signals we're seeing with EPR are present both in the, either only in the bulk or both on the surface and the bulk. Now, the next step is taking it to the surface. And for that, we're going to use into NAP-XPS. So the NAP-XPS spectrum is dominated by oxygen, bismuth, and molybdenum signals. And in the middle, you can see what's happening with bismuth. So just like other studies showed with other techniques, when we go from oxidizing conditions, lower the temperature, switch to propylene, and increase the temperature, the bismuth stays the same oxidation state, 3+. We see no sign of 5+ or 4+, but neither of 2+. And this does suggest that the bismuth does not directly participate in the reaction. On the right, we can see that the molybdenum is a very different story. Once we reduce the temperature and switch to propylene, we produce excessively more molybdenum 5+, and finally 4+. Now, let's take a deeper look at this. So on the left, you can see the molybdenum oxidation state distribution. Please note that the y-axis goes from 50%, so it's easier to see. And you can see how it changes as a function of the in situ conditions. We go from, again, oxidizing, lower temperature with reducing, and then increase the temperature. And you can see that we start producing 5+, and only at temperatures of 500 and above, we actually start to see 4+. We can also take a look at what happens to the Mel-Am composition, and what we can see here is that once we move from ultra-high vacuum room temperature conditions to in-situ conditions, the content of the molybdenum on the surface region increases. So this tells us that, yes, the molybdenum is reducing, but also that the composition of the surface region is dynamic and changes. And basically, overall, what this tells us, especially when we take a look at what happens in the reaction conditions, oxygen and propylene, is that molybdenum 6+ reduces to molybdenum 5+, temperature is below and equal to 450 C. And there's no molybdenum 4+ at the reaction temperature, which is shown here with the red line, which is 430. Finally, quasi-incidental age of slide spectra tells us a few things. So on the left and in the middle, you can see the molybdenum and bismuth signals as a function of depth of the catalyst. You can see it for 4 pre-treatments we did. You have the in gray oxidation, in orange reaction, in green the reducing, and finally in gold you have the reoxidation. And it's pretty hard to understand what's going on here based on these, but what you can do is you can use relative sensitivity factors to actually normalize the two. Then you can look at the atomic ratio of the two. And what you see here is that if you take a look at the oxidized and reaction condition catalyst, you can see that the molybdenum is enriched on the surface. So not only is this amorphous, we talked about all the previous things, also, there's much more molybdenum than you'd expect to see if you were looking at the bulk. And only at about 2 to 3 nanometers do you actually get to the molybdenum composition you'd expect to see in the bulk. Once you reduce this, the molybdenum is actually depleted from the surface. This gives us some information about what you'd expect on aging conditions. So molybdenum is vaporized from the surface, and you lose it. However, once you reoxidize, you get it back up. Not only do you get it back up, you get actually more molybdenum after reoxidation than you had before on the surface. So let's try to sum this all up. So we know from the X-ray and the Raman data that the alpha bismuth molybdate structure is stable during the reaction. Based on the NAP-XPS data, as well as the confirmation we have from the EPR, we can tell you that the irreducibility of surface bismuth 3+ and partial reduction of surface molybdenum 6+ to molybdenum 5+ under reaction condition contradicts the literature reaction models. Finally, using both the NAP-XPS and the lights, we can tell you the surface region is enriched by molybdenum. This increases with temperature, suggesting the molybdenum malfraction in the outermost surface layer may reach up to 100%, right? So we're close to 80% under the conditions we're looking at, which is after we did an anneal, reduced temperature, go into ultra-high vacuum. But from the NAP-XPS, we see that actually under reaction conditions, the molybdenum content goes up. So this suggests that if we're seeing 80% under those conditions, in reality, it could be closer to 100, hard to say. Now, taking all of this together along with the SPM, what we see is that instead of the surface we thought we had, which was an extension of the bulk, bimetallic sides, position similar to what you'd find in the bulk, what in fact we have are molybdenum oxide sites on a molybdenum-enriched amorphous surface layer, which are the active sites. Now, tying it back to the mechanisms that were suggested previously in the literature, what we see is that the lack of bismuth reduction agrees with both Bell and the early Goddard models, since we all see that only molybdenum is directly involved in propylene oxidation. One possible solution to the lack of molybdenum 4+, as well as the bismuth oxidation reduction that was suggested in the previous mechanisms, is that what we have is O insertion takes an oxygen from the bridging molybdenum bond. And this is the source of the O, which suggests why we're not seeing any molybdenum 4+. So, I'd like to thank Dr. Eric Walter from BNL for his help in the EPR, Professor Pension Lee and Yunfei Gao from NCSU for the help with the Institute of XRE, and Professor Eric Stack and Dr. Alexander Fletcher from UPenn for their help with the NCSU SDM. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening and be very happy to take any questions.
Hi there, I'm Rick Mechanic from the state. Have you run the reaction with just moly trioxide? No bismuth at all? In that physical pattern?
We have, which of these characterization techniques? I'm asking because we haven't necessarily, but I know there are cases in the literature.
Not even characterization, just the reaction itself. You can run the reaction just on moly trioxide, and what kind of characteristics do you see in the reaction compared to the moly bismuth monoxide?
We haven't done it personally. It's definitely existent in the literature.
Yeah. So I guess you're showing evidence for a lack of bismuth role directly in the active site. It has to be doing something. Otherwise,
Definitely.
we don't without the moly oxide. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is what is the bismuth doing?
Definitely. DFT models suggest pretty clearly that what the bismuth is doing is actually perturbing the molybdenum oxide sites. And this is what actually is responsible for the barrier performance we see on just molybdenum. So DFT definitely suggests this is what the bismuth is doing.